Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Morning, all the participants on behalf of Embassy of India in Berlin. Welcome to all of you, including our speakers of today's webinar. Focuses on the topic recent developments in labor, data protection, and tax framework in India. Today, we have our tax and legal partner, Khetan & Co. with us. They have their expert speakers, their insights on this very large and diverse topic. Will surely help all the German companies who are interested in considering India as their investment destination. And to convert this intent on the part of German businesses into actual investments in India, we from the Embassy of India had initiated this dedicated and strategic program team called Make in India Mittelstand. The program is India's red carpet for the German Mittelstand. The program is run on behalf of our embassy by EuroAsia Consulting as a knowledge partner, supported by a network of competent partners such as Khetan & Co., IGCC, Deutsche Bank, Rodel & Partner, KFWDG, SBI, and Global Innovation and Technology Alliance of CII. Along with that, we have many state governments in India partnering with us in this initiative, and also our National Investment Facilitation Agency, Invest India. MIM also provides free of cost benefits of special workshops, networking, information exchange, etc. Invest India, the official government agency, joins us and provides us insights into schemes and recent Indian policies of encouraging foreign investments into the country. The program has entered into its 6th year in September this year, achieving 148 onboarded investments of euro 1.4 billion. Under the program, our MIM team would be happy to roll out German Mittelstand companies interested to do business in India. With that, I would like to thank you once again, all of the participants and all the respected speakers from Khetan & Co. Khetan, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Manish, for a brief introduction of Make in India Mittelstand. Ladies and gentlemen, now we are moving towards our main presentation. Supratim, I'm just making you presenter, and you can share the screen. Great. Supratim, can you come to the partner slide, the team slide, so I can give introduction of your team. Sorry. Okay, thank you very much for joining Khetan & Co team. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have 4 speakers from Khetan team. First is Mr. Vinay Joy. He is a partner in the Corporate and Commercial Practice Group in Bangalore office and has advised a wide variety of clients on M&A transactions, joint ventures, private equity, venture capital transactions, due diligence exercises, and contractual matters. Vinay also serves as a member of white collar crime practice of the firm and has been involved in carrying out investigation based on whistleblower complaints into breaches of FCPA and the POCA, allegations of fraud and misconduct by senior officials, and theft of confidential and proprietary information. He has been recognized as Tier 1 practitioner of corporate and M&A and for employment and labor by Legal 500. Next speaker we have is Mr. Supratim. He is a partner in Corporate and Commercial Practice Group of Khetan & Co. He specializes in corporate and commercial transactions such as merger, acquisitions, joint ventures, and general corporate law advisory. Supratim has advised eminent clients in relation to information technology law in India, including data privacy and cybersecurity related issues. Third representative for Khetan is Ms. Vinita Krishnan. She is a director in direct tax practice in Mumbai. She has over 14 years of rich and varied experience in advising clients on domestic and international tax matters. And we also have Ms. Rashmi Deshpande. She is a partner in indirect tax practice group in Mumbai office and has advised a variety of clients on GST transactions, import and export issues, and crypto assets, along with due diligence exercises. Over to you, Vinay.
Thanks, Ketan. Supratim, can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am going to take you on a very quick, provide you with a brief background on the changes that have come about with respect to employment laws in India. Now, I'm sure a lot of you must have heard that India has, over the past couple of years, been undertaking this large consolidation exercise, which is effectively trying to sort of get together a bunch of our laws into 4 main codes. And what I've put out on the screen for you are the 4 codes that I've proposed, which are primarily the Code on Wages, the Industrial Relations Code, the Code on Social Security, and the Occupational Safety and Working Conditions Code. Now, if you see all of these codes, a lot of you who are familiar with doing business in India would know that there are a minefield of labor laws in India. We have approximately about 40 odd laws that apply to most business establishments from time to time. And this exercise largely was meant to try and consolidate them, also to sort of streamline them. Now, in a lot of parts, people could say that effectively this is just old wine being bottled into new bottles and sort of being sold, because a lot of concepts have simply been carried over. And to that extent, it's just been a consolidation exercise rather than one which brings about a whole lot of new changes. However, there have been certain progressive steps. There are steps which are beneficial to workers. There are steps which are beneficial to employers. And I will sort of, we do have limited time today, but what I'll try and do is to sort of try and take you through some of those major changes in the next slide. I'd just like to tell you that all of these 4 codes have been passed through the Houses of Parliament. They have received presidential assent. Basically, what is stopping it from becoming law today is really just it being notified in the official Gazette of India. And that will happen when certain rules are framed under each of these laws. Because you'll have to remember that while this exercise is a consolidation of the laws itself, to implement them, there are various rules which are required to be framed, and which are required to be framed by the central government as well as by state governments. Now, the central government has actually put out draft rules under these codes, which are up for public comment at this moment. And we are expecting that potentially a lot of these codes will come into force by early next year, or at least by the start of the next financial year. So that is really the timeline that we are looking at. So we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So these are, of course, overall, there are, because this is a vast topic in itself and is something that could merit, a whole session in itself. But what I've tried to do here is just try and outline some of the major changes that have been brought about under these 4 codes. Firstly, is a change to the definition of wages. Now, the wages code, one of the things that it does is it provides for a consolidated definition of wages, so that rather than having to look at the different definition of wages across various acts, which is provided for in the current context, under the new codes going forward, there'll be one uniform definition of wages which will apply across board. Now, the significant change that has been brought about here is that today a lot of employers have a habit of structuring wages in such a manner that it might, of course, comprise of certain wages which are deemed basic wages or dearness allowance. But a lot of chunks of wages are actually provided for under the heads of other allowances that are provided to employees, whether it's a special allowance, whether it's a conveyance allowance, other various other heads. Now, what that does is that under the current framework of our laws, since a lot of social security contributions are really made on basic wages, effectively, the lower the basic wages, the lower the contribution that is made on behalf of the employee. So what the law has now done is that they have suggested that if the components which exclude, say, basic wages or dearness allowance, if those components make up more than 50% of an employee's wages, then the wages will be balanced in such a manner that the basic wage component comes up to be 50%. Now, why that impacts the employer and the employee is that the contributions, etc., which are to be made with respect to the employees will now be made basis that 50% calculation, which will happen. So this will largely impact those employees who are earning, say, below a wage threshold of 15,000. Why that is because your provident fund contributions are calculated on that threshold largely. But if there are establishments which are not using that threshold, then these contributions could be much higher, of course, and employers would be required to sort of make those contributions. This could, on the pitfall side for employees, it could also result in them taking away less take-home salary on a monthly basis. So I think this will lead to some introspection amongst companies in that they'll have to see how their wages are structured. The second change is, again, the Payment of Wages Act, which currently applies and which sort of requires employers to make payments to employees on a monthly basis, prescribes what sort of deductions can be made from salaries, etc. Now, that currently applies with respect to employees who earn up to 24,000 rupees per month. Now that wage threshold has been done away with, and this is meant to apply to every employee in every establishment. So that's one large change again. The third change is that of a national minimum wage. Under the wages code, it is now proposed that there would be there'll be a national minimum wage which the central government will prescribe. And effectively, of course, state governments have also been given the rights to sort of provide for minimum wages in their respective states, but it will need to be higher than the national minimum wage which has been prescribed. So what this is in effect attempting to do is to provide for a minimum basis below which no person in the country can get wages. So it's to set a minimum wage across board. Now, this could, of course, lead to some changes, and we'll have to see what levels these are pegged at, because obviously the minimum wage levels in metropolitan cities, for example, whether it's a New Delhi, whether it's a Mumbai, Bangalore, the rates are going to be higher than, or the cost of living is going to be much higher than what it might be in, say, rural Uttar Pradesh or any other territories in the country. So we'll have to see how this national minimum wage is arrived at and how it conceptually works out. But that's one of the larger changes which is being made. Coming to changes under the Industrial Relations Code. Now, there are a couple of significant changes here. One, of course, is the increase in threshold for applicability of the Standing Orders Act and stricter provisions with respect to retrenchment, layoff, or closure of establishment. Currently, these provisions apply to all establishments that have 100 workers or more. Now, the threshold for that has been increased to 300. Now, what this will end up doing is it will allow mid-size establishments, that is establishments now who will have up to 300 workers, with a lot more flexibility with respect to carrying out reductions in force exercises, whether they want to sort of lay off people, or even just in terms of prescribing for rules and procedures within their establishment. This will now sort of provide for some sort of a higher threshold, and therefore giving them that flexibility. This has been sort of called out as being sort of anti-worker by a lot of trade unions. But to my mind, this is one of the most significant changes, because it is meant to allow employers to go out, hire people, be able to fire people much more easily than they can under the current framework. And therefore, this is a big advantage to employers. One other change which has been brought in the Industrial Relations Code is with respect to a worker reskilling fund. Now, what this is meant to provide for is that at the time that an employer terminates the employment of an employee, in addition to all other severance payments or statutory payments which are to be made, they have provided for something called a worker reskilling fund, into which 15 days of salary of the employee needs to be deposited by the company. The fund will effectively then pass on those funds to the employee. Notionally, of course, the employee is required to utilize those funds to be able to improve his or her skill set, or to try and reskill or upskill themselves. Unfortunately, it doesn't require, the law doesn't at this time lay out a lot of guidance on how that is supposed to happen. And therefore, there is a fear that effectively the worker could simply use those funds for whatever purpose, and the reskilling fund in itself will not serve any purpose. That is one of the criticisms of this concept. But again, it's a new concept that they have sought to bring in, at least with good intentions, at least. The next change is with respect to fixed term employment and the payment of gratuity to such workers. So one large change which has been brought about is now we can officially recognize the concept of fixed term employees in regular establishments. while the current framework of law under the Industrial Establishment Standing Orders Act does provide for the concept of fixed term workers, it's not very commonly used because of the sort of benefits that they can that they are entitled to receive. However, now the law in itself contemplates a category of workers who are fixed term employees. The only conditionality specified with respect to them is that they are entitled to receive the same sort of benefits that other permanent workers would receive. And provided that they have served for at least 1 year with an establishment, they would then be entitled to receive gratuity. As a lot of you might know, gratuity is a long-term benefit which is typically otherwise provided only to employees who have served with an establishment for 5 continuous years. Now that threshold has come down with respect to fixed-term employees to 1 year. So that's a large change that we see. Coming to trade unions, there's now a concept of what is called a sole trade union or a negotiating trade union, which means that in an establishment, if you have more than 51% of the workers who belong to or affiliated to a particular trade union, then that trade union would necessarily need to be recognized by the employer and would be the negotiating trade union. If, for example, you have a scenario where multiple worker groups are affiliated with different trade unions, then no particular trade union has more than 51% of the workers as their members, the company would be required to set up what is called a negotiating council, which will comprise of trade union members, such that each trade union that has more than 20% of the workers of the establishment, they are eligible to get 1 seat on this negotiating council, and that will be the council which will then negotiate terms for the workers with the employers. There's a large change because currently, other than a few states in India, most of them don't provide for recognition of trade unions per se by an employer, and therefore this is meant to sort of facilitate the talks between workers and employers. I think the changes that I've outlined on the right side, by and large, certain thresholds have increased. The number of workers in a factory from 20, it has been increased to 40 for you to be able to apply for a factory's license. Concept of a core activity of an establishment. Some of these concepts have been there, but more coming through case law rather than through the law itself. I would say that the changes that I've just sort of discussed right now are probably some of the larger changes. Of course, like I said, this is a large topic which can comprise of a lot of other, a whole webinar in itself. But I'll be happy to sort of take any questions right at the end. Should people have any questions about these changes or anything else that they've heard of. So Pratim, please, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vinay. So the topic that I would be covering is is data privacy and protection. Really, you are aware that there's a new law which is in the making, which is akin to EU's GDPR. But before we deep dive into that, let us understand the kinds of data that any organization at any given point in time needs to handle. So the first one is a large bubble that you see on the right-hand side, which is confidential data. Now, this could be your know-how, your customers, know-how, confidential data, etc., which may or may not contain personal or sensitive personal data. How do you protect this in your organization? You will have contractual measures, you will deploy tech measures, etc. So that is how you're protecting confidential data. Then comes the personal data bucket, which is in the left-hand side, larger bucket. This could be any information through which you can identify a natural person, say a phone number, a mobile, an email address, etc. As per today's Indian law, on a sector-neutral basis, you should remember that consent is king. So for personal data, you need to ensure that you have taken adequate consent. In the center is sensitive personal data or information. Now, if you're handling any sensitive personal data, and I'll give you the elements in the next slide, remember there are 2 pillars. One pillar is adequate consent, and the second pillar is even after you have taken consent, you need to safeguard that data in a particular manner. So what do we have as a law in India today? The reason why I'm covering this is because there is a notion that, India does not have any law right now. There is one which is in the making, which is not correct. we have the Information Technology Act on a sector neutral basis. And we have this Information Technology Reasonable Security Practices and Procedures and Sensitive Personal Data or Information Rules 2011. In short, we'll call it the Privacy Rules or SPDI rules. So these set of rules and the IT Act governs on a sector neutral basis how you should handle personal and sensitive personal data. Then we have sectoral regulations. For example, the Reserve Bank of India giving its diktat to banks and NBFCs, IRDAI giving its diktat to insurance players, so on and so forth. There are other legislations also. For example, the Indian Contract Act, the Indian Penal Code, the Consumer Protection Act. All of these play a patchwork role in data privacy and protection framework in India. Let's talk about a couple of sections just so that you understand what do we have as a law today. Section 43A of the IT Act deals with sensitive personal data. And for that, you have to have reasonable security practices and procedures. If there is any wrongful loss or wrongful gain caused, then damages are payable by way of compensation. Interestingly, when GDPR came into effect, a lot of companies with EU interface sat up and said that, oh, we need to be compliant because the penalties are huge. It's 20 million euro or 4% of annual global turnover. Now, interestingly, if you observe this, we always had and we still have Section 43A, which is an uncapped bucket for damages, and this could be quite damaging. So what is sensitive data as per the IT Act and the rules that we are speaking about? It is passwords, biometric, sexual information, sexual orientation, physical, physiological, mental health condition, medical records and history, financial information such as bank account or credit card or debit card or other payment instrument details. Interestingly, when we do due diligences for mergers and acquisitions of, say, small, mid-sized companies, very often we come across this statement that, oh, we are a very simple company, we do not handle any sensitive data. And then when we look into their practices and procedures, we will find there is biometric attendance at the gate. We will see that the HR would be having a lot of medical information, perhaps because of medical insurance, so on and so forth. You just get examples where just because of lack of understanding, even if organizations are handling sensitive data, perhaps they are not adequately aware about it. So in case you are handling sensitive data, what should you be doing? All these requirements have to be followed. Largely, these are inexpensive. Apart from the first bucket, which is right at the top, reasonable security practices and procedures, which is stating ISO 27001 as one of the requirements. But apart from that, there are norms in relation to collection, disclosure, privacy policy related requirements, consent related requirements, transfer related requirements, and grievance officer details. All these is all about knowledge and knowing what you need to do, and not much of a cost element attached to it. The other section is section 72A. Now, 72A deals with personal information only, 72A of the Information Technology Act. If you have obtained any kind of personal information, say mobile number or email address, things like those, whilst providing services, and if it is disclosed without the consent of the natural person or in breach of a lawful contract, then there could be imprisonment up to 3 years or fine up to 5 lakh rupees, 0.5 million INR, that is, or both. So that's what we have today. Now, what we are looking forward to is a GDPR equivalent law, which is quite comprehensive. It is now with the Joint Parliamentary Committee. Most probably early next year, this will be debated in the Parliament and will become a law. Interestingly, just for your knowledge, we have been part and parcel of this making of the law right from the beginning. We have been working with Justice Sri Krishna Committee and given inputs at every level, including the ministry. The MeitY had separately called me, and I had gone to Delhi and given inputs on on this personal data protection bill. Why are people really taking sitting up and working towards compliance of this particular law? Is because of this, perhaps. The penalties are quite high, akin to your GDPR or competition law type of a penalty. It is 15 crores or and 4% of total worldwide turnover, whichever is higher, is one bucket. The second bucket is 5 crore rupees or 2% of total worldwide turnover, whichever is higher. There are imprisonment provisions and there are compensation provisions. So if I have to give you a snapshot of what we are expecting in the new bill, there will be extraterritorial jurisdiction. Key definitions have been introduced. For example, scope of sensitive personal data will increase. The elements are increasing. I'll show you in the next slide. Data localization, that the data should be housed within the country. There are discussions around this. Cross-border data transfer related aspects will come in akin to international standards. New compliances are being brought in, like impact assessment, data protection officers, etc. New data subject rights, like if you are an organization and you are taking sensitive personal information, the data subject or the person whose data it is can come knocking at your door and ask you that, please let me know what data do you have about me. I want to edit it, delete it, all of that. And you have to give that right to the individual. This can be both inward looking and outward looking, your own employee data or your customer client data. There are, of course, heavy penalties and compensation that I spoke about, and there'll be a designated data protection authority. This is just a quick snapshot of the sensitive personal data sets that will increase. On the left-hand side is what we have today. In the center is what the bill is proposing to have as a set of sensitive personal data. You can see the long list. It also has element such as official identifier, the fourth one, which includes your PAN number, Aadhaar, etc. On the right-hand side, just for comparison, I have put the special categories of personal data or sensitive personal data that is under the GDPR. Like I was mentioning, there are data principal rights or data subject rights that will come into play, like right to confirmation and access. The individual can ask you, please let me know what data do you have. I want to exercise my right to be forgotten, right to data portability, that is porting it to another player, right to correction and erasure. So this erasure part was not there in the previous version of the bill. It has now been brought in. There are compliances also which will increase, such as privacy by design, transparency, security safeguards, breach notification, grievance redressal. There are also few which are applicable to a higher category of data controllers or significant data fiduciaries, as they are calling it in the bill, such as data protection officer, record keeping and data audits, and doing impact assessment. Just a short point here. Many organizations are already GDPR compliant, and somehow they think that they need not bother about the Indian law because GDPR is already global gold standard. Well, that is not absolutely correct. From our example, we have seen that there are significant differences, and at times the Indian law, the present day Indian law, forget about the upcoming one, is slightly stricter as compared to the GDPR. Let me give you a couple of examples. We were told by a bank to do a dipstick analysis. They were already GDPR compliant, and they said, why don't you do a dipstick analysis and tell us whether there is anything required to be done as far as Indian laws are concerned. And we observed that age of consent, simple examples I'm throwing. Age of consent, which is 18 years in India, is 16 years in GDPR, and it can go below up to 13 years depending on member states. So there's a difference. Also, financial information is sensitive personal data even today under Indian law, but under GDPR, it is not a special category of data. So just a few examples. Let me talk about a little controversial point here, which is data localization, that is housing of the data within the country. I think from the previous version of the bill to the present version, there has been relaxation, but there is a lot more to do, and debate is still happening on this in the Joint Parliamentary Committee. Personal data, as per the present version of the bill, personal data can freely go out of the country, no problem there. Sensitive personal data should continue to be stored in India, only conditional transfer is possible. And critical personal data can never leave the country technically, unless there are very stringent conditions under which it can. But critical personal data set is yet to be defined. So that's in a snapshot, and very happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you. Over to you, Vinny.
Hello, everyone. So next slide, please. So today I would be focusing on key perspective from an Indian income tax perspective. So I have divided into 6 baskets, as you can see on the slide, and I would take each of them in detail. Next slide, please. So to start with, one of the very interesting thing is in general, Indian companies have to pay tax at a base corporate rate of 30%. And over and above, there are certain cess and surcharge which is added. And effectively, the tax rate works out to be around 35% roughly. And Indian government, to make India a very attractive destination, have actually rolled out concessional tax provisions whereby an Indian company can choose to pay tax at as low at the rate of 15%, especially if it is going to be engaged in a manufacturing entity. And if a company which is already existing in India, say the German parent already has an existing Indian subsidiary, while traditionally the subsidiary may be paying a tax at the rate of 30% base rate, they can very well choose to be governed by a concessional rate of 22%. Now, of course, 15 and 22 comes with certain ifs and buts. And to start with, for a manufacturing entity, if we are planning to set up a subsidiary in India or a joint venture whereby there is an Indian partner which is going to engage in the manufacturing activity, or even in our automobile industry, of course, where automobile assembly, is it a manufacturer or not, has to be evaluated on a case-to-case basis. But this is something which we should keep in mind. And for manufacturing companies, when they pay tax at base rate of 15%, and with surcharge and cess, effectively it is around 17. And the advantage for them is there is a concept which is called as book profit based tax. Essentially, it means even though you do not have a taxable income basis, the provisions of the way the income tax provisions are worded, but if you have profits in your financial statements, subject to certain adjustments, you need to pay a book profit tax. While the name is minimum, it is a misnomer because the tax rate is roughly around 15% base rate. So it's a pretty high rate. So this is an advantage for a company which is a manufacturing entity to really see whether they can choose for 15%. And amongst any other country, we can proudly say India is amongst very few countries which has such a low rate. And in terms of the transition from 35 to 22%, we have seen many companies really, going into the thinking box, whether they should really opt for or not. And there are certain sensitivity analysis to be looked at it, because the moment you take the 22%, there are certain tax losses which are in form of like a tax depreciation, additional depreciation you would need to give off. And so that is an analysis one has to look at it. But all in all, this tax rate reductions have been viewed very favorably and positively across both domestic and foreign investors. The second important change I would like to highlight is amongst the revamping of the dividend tax. Historically, the dividends, if your Indian subsidiary was declaring and giving to the German parent, while there was no tax in the hands of German parent in India, but there was clearly a tax leakage called as dividend distribution tax, which the Indian company had to pay. And more often than not, this dividend distribution tax was also becoming a sunk cost in most of the investors, not just in Germany, because it is not technically a withholding tax or a tax directly paid by the shareholder. In the recent budget, the dividend tax has been now again shifted to the shareholder level. And so from our perspective, if the German parent has a subsidiary in India or a JV or an investment entity in India, if they are going to take out dividends, it can be as low as 10%, which is definitely very efficient way of repatriating profits out of India. And also, since it is like a withholding tax, it is likely that you would also get a credit. Of course, it is dependent on German laws, but since it is a withholding tax, the possibility for an investor to get a credit is fairly simpler and easier. The third important basket is in terms of with the aim to make India a hub or an international financial center. Government of India has been really floating the idea of international financial services, while that it has been there in law since a while. But there are a lot of tax incentives which have been announced, and especially this may be very relevant for any banks which may already have a presence here, even it is available for a foreign entity, especially if I look from our German investors' perspective. And the incentives are, while these financial centers are treated as part of an non-resident for the Indian exchange control, for tax purposes, they are still treated as resident. And there are tax incentives when they earn income, there is no tax they need to pay. Of course, if they have to be paying minimum alternate tax, there is a concessional rate announced for them. And even for the investors who have invested in the units which are being traded in the exchange, there are certain tax benefits. So if anyone is looking at a financial center, and especially in any banking sector, one can really explore whether to set up an entity in GIFT City or not. The fourth important change is, again, while it's more for a sovereign wealth fund and pension fund, from our perspective, if we do note that there is a sovereign wealth fund of the German government. Now, if that fund is interested in making investment in India, especially if it is in infrastructure sectors and social infrastructure such as hospitality, housing, there are clear tax advantages, such as whether the returns are in form of dividends, interest coupon, or even an exit, which is like if you are there for at least which qualify as a long term, those gains will be completely tax exempt. And even in terms of what are the investment sectors, it is a defined category, and one would need to really go to the government, get themselves notified. And we have been seeing that Indian government has been very swift in really recognizing a sovereign wealth fund as an eligible fund. Next slide, please. The fifth important change is amongst the pandemic situation. Indian government was very swift to recognize that there could be a case where there may be foreign expats who are stranded in India because of the connectivity issues, and because still now, at least in India, the airlines, while it has been started international level, whether it is at a commercial level, it's going at a slow pace. So Indian government came up with a relaxation that people who are stranded in India during the time when the lockdown was announced, there is a particular date that should not be counted while determining their residency test. Now, this is very relevant for any individuals because India follows to compute residency based on your physical presence in India. So that's an important relief for investor or for any individual who would be, sitting here and working for any foreign entity. That said, that relaxation has been announced only for the tax year 20. For the current year, everyone is looking with a hope that this will also be announced soon, as it has raised certain burning issues. Like, because today we have seen many companies either who have engaged employees who are stuck in India and they are working for the foreign entity. Now, whether their presence in India can expose the foreign entity to a taxable presence, well, that is not just an India-specific issue, while it is a global issue, but we hope this may be clarified in the upcoming budget of the Indian government. There were certain concessional regime which was announced as a COVID measure. Was there has been relaxation in terms of timing or meeting the compliances, and overall withholding tax, especially if you make any domestic payment, like if you have to make a salary withholding tax, there has been for example, if it is a salary, there has been a reduction in terms of the domestic withholding tax rate. The next important change is the introduction of a tax called as tax collection at source. While this has been there in the Indian tax law, but interesting is they have introduced this concept which is applicable from October 1st, is if the seller is selling any goods in India, and the goods value is around Indian rupees 50 lakhs, which is roughly around 5 million. And the seller, whether the sale value in a particular financial year meets the threshold or it is one time, it's fine. Both of the thresholds can be included. And the seller should have a turnover which is at least 100 million in the last tax year. Then the seller is duty bound to collect a tax called as tax collection at source. So how does it impact? While this tax was already introduced for a company engaged in motor cars. So for an automobile company, this was already there in the law. There they were required to collect TCS from their customers, but now it is also applicable to any kind of goods. So whether it is your day-to-day sale of your normal stock in trade, or whether it would also include any capital goods is a matter of interpretation. And the very interesting point is now, since the goods have not been defined, now whether it can technically include shares of a company, and this is affecting in most of the M&A share purchase deals where we are working on, where we are seeing there are buyers, there are sellers, and despite the seller being a non-resident, whether they are required to collect it is something which is being evaluated, because shares are technically good, so that can get covered. While there are some relaxations, such as if you are going to import from India or India is going to export to you, those goods will not be subject to TCS. So with respect to any transactions between your Indian subsidiary or Indian counterpart, that should not be a worrisome thing. But in terms of shares, whether strictly it is an export or not is a matter of interpretation. So it will continue to apply view emanating. And the fourth or the sixth important change is the tax dispute resolution. The Indian government has introduced like a scheme whereby there is a speedy disposal of any pending disputes. This is called as Vivad Se Vishwas. And what it achieves, historically, the Indian litigation is normally very prolonged. And if you see, the cost of litigation is definitely there. Over and above the cost of litigation, there is always a tax amount. On the tax, there is always a period, the interest is also computed. And many times we have seen where the litigation is long drawn, the interest cost itself looks to be a very big balloon. And the third basket is a penalty, while that's not automatic. So under this dispute resolution mechanism, a taxpayer, whether they are resident or a non-resident, can approach the tax authorities to settle their pending tax disputes subject to certain conditions. And what they achieve is they need to pay the tax upfront, but the interest and penalty will be waived. And in case there are any prosecution kind of risk which is being pursued, that also should be waived. This comes with certain conditions, but this also has been looked very favorably. And currently we have seen many clients looking really to go and settle for their disputes under the dispute resolution mechanism. Now, again, pressure point, whether you would really want to go this route or not is a matter of exercise, which will vary on case-to-case basis. But that's something which is very commendable on part of the Indian government to see that a speedy resolution mechanism has been introduced. The last basket which I may want to touch upon is in terms of the digital taxation regime, and India has been very active, and there has been constant tug of war between the Indian taxpayer and the Indian authorities when you just give something over online, whether it amounts to have any tax in India or not. In this regard, India has come up with a levy called as equalization levy. Interestingly, this is neither an income tax, neither an indirect tax. So therefore, the classification in your domestic country, whether you would get a credit or not, has become a big challenge. And how does it impact for someone who's not in an online business? Say, even if you are a German parent, and for your business purpose, you may have a cloud storage with your Indian entity where an information or a data is shared over the cloud platform, or service is given over the cloud platform. Still, they may be required to be subject to equalization levy. And currently, there has been a huge debate because the way this is worded, it is very widely worded. And there have been representations to really downplay the rigors of this levy, and there are huge developments expected in this regard. And also in terms of any subscription, even your Indian subsidiary would have taken to any database subscription, such as downloading information about the markets, if they have subscribed to subscription which is being given by a foreign entity, whether this would be subject to equalization levy, while it's a cost of the foreign entity. But from an Indian payer point of view, you need to be mindful to ensure that the foreign entity is paying proper tax. Otherwise, you can be assessed as their agent. So this is another important development, while one would need to look at it. And all in all, these are the key developments in the Indian taxation space. Come in early next year to see whether there are any relaxations which are announced. Supru, next slide, and over to you, Rashmi.
Thanks, Vinita. Interesting developments as far as direct tax are concerned. So on the indirect tax front, of course, there have been a lot of developments. As all of you would be knowing, GST was introduced in India somewhere in July 2017. After that, although there have been a lot of attempts which are being made, not only by the government, by streamlining the system, which is the GST network, but also there have been a lot of writ petitions which are actually being filed in various other courts. So to say, when we sit in the end of the year 2020, although GST prima facie seems to have settled down, there are a lot of disputes still which are pending, and at the same time, the government which had introduced the GST network, via which all the compliances related to GST were supposed to happen on the network, although that seems to have settled, there are a lot of issues which are still happening with the GST network. Now, apart from GST being one of the major changes and the fact that it is still streamlining, there are a lot of other changes which are happening on the customs front, as well as things which are happening on the foreign trade policy front. So what the foreign trade policy, which is a policy which is supposed to give incentives to all the exporters whenever they are importing things in India based on whatever their revenue was in the last couple of years, this foreign trade policy is going to change in the next year. And the foreign trade policy is something which is established for 4 years. So by 2021, we are going to see the major changes, and this is going to affect the import and export of goods as well as services within India. To begin with, there used to be a scheme called the Merchant Export from India scheme. And this scheme was specifically for the purposes of importing goods in India. The importers of goods used to apply for this scheme, and they used to get incentives while they were paying certain taxes here in India. This particular scheme is now going to be replaced by something called the Remission of Duties and Taxes on Export Product scheme. In short, it is called the RoDTEP scheme. This RoDTEP scheme is going to be effective from January next year. Similarly, because there has been a change in MEIS scheme, which is specifically meant for goods, we are also expecting some changes for services. There was a scheme, as most of you would be knowing, known as SEIS scheme. And since at the WTO level, MEIS was the one which was questioned by the WTO panel, we are expecting that the government is going to make some changes and also overhaul the SEIS scheme as well. Apart from that, the government is actually promoting the Make in India. As a result of Make in India scheme, a lot of imports that were happening from many other countries, especially China, the import and especially related to electronic material, the customs duty, we have seen the trend in the past few years, the customs duty on these goods have been increased. And there are a lot of incentives which are given by the government for manufacturing units who are going to set up or have already set up manufacturing establishments here in India. I have noted down the 3 major schemes which seem very attractive to those of you who are interested in coming here and basically start their manufacturing units. One is the Electronic Manufacture Cluster Scheme, which is specifically for all kinds of electronic manufacturing here, which will start in India. The other is a scheme for promotion of manufacturing of electronic components and semiconductors. Along with that, the recently introduced scheme is called the Production Linked Incentive Scheme. Now, all these schemes are basically not only giving emphasis on manufacture of the final product, like for example, laptops and computers, or even for that matter, phones. But they are also giving a lot of emphasis for any manufacturing unit which is being set up here in India for the purposes of raw material also. And linked to all these schemes are specifically provided by the center, we also have certain schemes which are provided by the state, depending on whichever state the manufacturing unit is going to come up. So the overall idea, and this is the principle which the Indian government is following for the past 2 or 3 years, is that they want to have more and more manufacturing units here in India. So therefore, the emphasis is to ensure that the manufacturing happens in India, and all the import material or the raw material or the finished goods which are coming from outside India, the duty, the customs duty on these products have been increased. Now, apart from that, the major thing that probably one should keep in mind is the GST procedure. Now, thanks to the pandemic, most of the dates, or for example, the compliances related to GST have been postponed to 31st of December or further than that. But there are other schemes also at the same time which are being introduced by the government. For example, the e-invoicing scheme. This is also keeping in mind the principle that the government wants to have all the compliances related to GST followed online. Now, e-invoicing scheme from 1st of October 2020 was specifically introduced for
I guess Rashmi is disconnected. Let's give her 1 minute to rejoin. Thank you for your patience. Yeah.
preparedness, this 1st January date could be extended. Now, the another thing which the government has introduced in terms of GST procedure is that all the invoice, all the payments, as well as the returns were being made on a monthly basis. However, due to the pandemic and also the fact that they want to give some concessions to small time service providers and small time manufacturers, the returns have been made on a quarterly basis, although the payment has to be paid on a monthly basis itself. Apart from that, like I said in the beginning, there are still a lot of litigation which is going on in terms of GST. And not only the government, but also government with the help of GST Council, which is an extremely active body when it comes to making rules and regulations surrounding GST. The courts have also been very proactive in terms of streamlining the GST compliances. Overall, we are looking at a time of maybe another 2 to 3 years. After that, the GST will completely settle down and the compliances will be all online without any glitches. As far as businesses doing compliances here in India are concerned, initially we used to, initially all the compliances had to be done in India, but considering everything is online, now the compliances can be carried out at anywhere from India or outside India as well. This is the biggest advantage which GST has introduced. As far as litigations are concerned, of course, there are similar schemes like Vinita had mentioned under income tax. There are a similar scheme to streamline the GST compliances, GST litigations, as well as the service tax and excise litigation. So that is also very much in place. And overall, due to the fact that everything is going to happen online, the compliances related to indirect taxes have been made quite simple. So those are some of the highlights. Over to you, Ketan.
Thank you, Rashmi, and actually a full team of Khaitan & Company for covering all the taxation topics at all fronts so briefly and in concise manner. So ladies and gentlemen, we are opening our forum for Q&A session. So if you have any questions or if you have any remarks, please click on raised hand icon, and then I can unmute you to have your question or to listen to your remarks. I repeat, you just need to click on raised hand icon if you have any questions, then we can take up your questions. So so Khaitan team, we are not having any questions, I guess. I think we should give some more time to audience to come back with questions. So we will be sharing all the contact details of the speakers. I'm sure that we will be having questions, so you can get in connect with us at mam@indianembassy.de or the respective speaker email IDs shared to you over the email. And maybe from Khaitan and Company, if Vinay, you want to give some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Ketan. No, thank you for having us, giving us the opportunity to sort of present here today. Even if there are questions that come up later, we'd be sort of happy to take them up and sort of come back to the participants with responses. And we are, of course, always available. One thing which we didn't specifically mention is, as a firm, we do have a German desk, and we did, prior to this pandemic, we did make regular trips to Germany as well, different practice areas, and we've been coming and been part of the MIIM journey for the past 6 years that the program has been running, and we'd be delighted to sort of work with existing members, new members, all of them, and we'd be happy to help you with your Indian legal requirements.
Sure.
Thanks, Ketan. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Khaitan team. Thank you, Manish from Embassy of India, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this webinar. We will share the presentations with you along with the YouTube recording, which you can then share also with your colleagues to spread the MIIM program and its benefits. Thank you very much. Look forward to welcome you in next year. So wishing you Merry Christmas in advance. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, everyone.
Happy New Year and Merry Christmas.
Bye-bye.